I am delighted and privileged to be speaking with potholer54, also known as Peter Hadfield, not least because I know he never generally does interviews like this. He runs one of the best channels on YouTube, debunking false scientific claims, with a big focus over the years on climate change and recently on COVID-19. So, potholer54, wonderful to be speaking to you.
Yeah, very good to talk to you, Mallen. Thanks very much for having me on. And I will just elaborate a bit on that because, as you say, I never do these kind of things, and I get so many requests from people. Could you come on my podcast? Could you be on my show? The reason I don't do it is because I'm just a bloody journalist, and it's in our blood that we're not supposed to inject ourselves into the story. I'm not the story. The story is whatever it is I'm reporting. And what I'm concerned about is if I do these, then everybody will want an interview, and then it turns into a free-for-all, and then they'll say, well, you did it for so-and-so, how come you can't do it for me? So this is a special favor to you, and I'll tell people why, because I was so impressed with one of your videos that last year, people don't know this, but I asked you if I could mirror it. COVID overtook us, unfortunately, and I haven't had a chance to fit it in, but I am going to do it. And I was very impressed with that video, and that's how we got into communication. So I feel I owe you a favor as well, and apart from the fact I'm impressed with the channel. So I think it's a returning of the favor, which is certainly a one-off for you. That I can tell everybody else watching now, I'm not going to do for everyone.
Well, I'm delighted that I'm the beneficiary of that happy accident. Before we go on to talk about the channel and some of the issues that sort of come out of that, one quick note then, because you mentioned COVID and you mentioned you're working as a journalist. How has it been for you working as a journalist in Australia through this extraordinary time that we've been living through over the last year?
Well, I tell you, I mean, I've descended from covering international summits and revolutions to last week going to an emu farm. So it's been, I'm stuck here in Australia, and so I'm sort of jobbing for various programs, because one of the problems is, especially in the UK where I do a lot of my work, they can't get out and about to do reporting. So I'm getting a lot of people coming to me now and saying, look, could you send us something from Australia? So the emu farm was interesting, but it's not the same as covering a revolution. So I'm looking forward to getting back out and doing that kind of thing.
Yes, indeed. It has been something like a dozen years since you started the potholer54 channel.
Yeah, about 2006, I think it was, yeah.
If you can remember back that far, what prompted you to start it all in the first place?
Right, good question. We'd moved to Australia very recently, and I was in Japan, for like 16 years and reporting on the Far East, and then we moved to Australia in 2001. And I had a bit more free time on my hands, and I was joining some chat rooms, and I joined one that was a fundamentalist Christian chat room, and I was just intrigued to see how. I mean, I was just amazed to discover these videos on the internet with people geologists who thought the world was 6,000 years old, and all these crazy stuff coming out of America. Now, you're British, and your audience is mostly British, and we grew up not knowing people like that. I never knew any Christian fundamentalists until I met some American ones when I was about, 25 or 26. It's just not something you're used to. So I was very interested getting on these chat forums to find out what these people thought. And they did not have a clue about how basic science worked. And I thought, this is the problem. Now I get it. Now I understand why they think what they think. They haven't logically brought themselves into this by looking at evidence and so on, the way that any rational person would do. They were born into this, and they have no clue about what the science is. And after a while, I got fed up trying to explain it all to them about how evolution works and how natural selection works. So I thought, well, it's much easier to explain in graphic form. So I started doing some videos, and I said, look, I put this up on this new thing called YouTube. Go and take a look, and instead of me having to explain it to you in written form, have a look at these videos. And that started the Made Easy series. Now, I did this series going from the start of the universe, the Big Bang, right the way through to human ancestry and the diaspora out of Africa, controversial, And that was really the series that got the channel noticed. It actually turned out to be one of the most popular channels in Australia at the time. But I did make the huge mistake of splitting it because I was worried that if it got hijacked, I might not get it back. So I split into two different channels and I started another one called potholer54 debunks. And Thunderfoot and I, who started off about the same time, he's gone gangbusters. And we were starting off at the same level with the same number of subscribers. And when I split it, suddenly good old Thunderfoot was going streaks ahead because he kept the one channel. And everybody said to me, no, it was a mistake getting two. And so it probably doesn't have the popularity a lot of people say that it should. But I then switched into doing other things after I'd finished the creation bit. So that's a very long answer to your very short question, Mallen.
No, well, that's kind of what these things are set up to do. So it's been the place over those 12 years. I mean, it's gained a reputation for being a sort of prime place for debunking bad science and false claims. It doesn't feel like it's needed any less today than it was 12 years ago. Do we feel as though anything's changed over those 12 years, or has it even gone backwards? What's your sense?
I don't know. I think there's been a bit of a pushback in the COVID year because, I did a video right at the beginning when the pandemic started back in April, looking at President Trump and his misrepresentation of science. And I said to people, look, this is not a political video. This is not saying whether he's a good president or a bad president. You can have your own opinion on that. But as far as the facts go, we have to start correcting facts that are being misrepresented. And I thought, after years of banging on about things like vaccinations and GMOs and climate change, which are very intangible and very far away for a lot of people, suddenly here's something that people can relate to because it's in their backyard. It's a president misrepresenting the science, and from that leads to a bad policy, which leads to deaths. And people are very familiar with the fact that now, up to 500,000 Americans are dying because of this. Now, I say Americans because this is mainly a problem in the United States. I don't notice it quite so badly in other countries. So it was really directed at an American audience. And I thought, now people will get it. They will now get it. And unfortunately, they didn't get it because all that happened was, I thought, well, they can't deny that this pandemic is happening. They can't deny that hundreds of thousands of people are dying because of these bad policy decisions. And blow me down, they did. Suddenly there's this whole new conspiracies coming up about, no, people aren't really dying. The hospitals are empty and these graves are not being filled up with dead people at all, and nothing's happening, and we can all go back to normal.
It has been a remarkable thing, because we've had people in the UK creeping into hospitals on bank holidays and wandering around the outpatient areas, so they've got some empty corridors to film. And
yes, I'm actually doing something on that, Mallen. Yeah.
Are you? Good. But I mean, it's a remarkable. I get a sense now that any major event that happens that gets worldwide attention is now going to attract almost immediately this sort of coterie of conspiracy theorist responses to it, whatever it may be. And I read something recently that sort of pointed out that the conspiracy theories of old used to be very focused on looking at evidence and reinterpreting it, looking at the photos from the moon landing and saying, look, there's this line here and so on and so on. Whereas the conspiracy theorists of today have just divorced themselves from the need for evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
And
I think that's very true.
And that goes to the heart of what your channel is there for, doesn't it, really? Because you're there saying, look to the evidence, look to the research. When we say do your own research, we don't mean go off and read a blog. We mean go to the authoritative sources. And this seems to me the struggle that, if anything, it's not that we're losing it, but there's now this growing group that is so diametrically on the other side. It's hard to know what the engagement points are sometimes.
You've actually put your finger on it. I think they've suddenly realized, oh, hang on, we don't need evidence. I mean, they used to think up, well, we've got to come to the conclusion first, then we've got to cherry pick the evidence to support it. That's what they used to do, as you rightly say. And now, they've realized that people are quite prepared to believe anything. They don't even need to see the evidence. So I mean, it's just amazing that someone will put a tweet out or something will get plastered around Facebook pages, and then people will not bother to check it. They'll just send it out to everybody else on their mailing list, and they're not even bothered about looking for the evidence. And yet, it's such a very simple thing to do because you don't need to go out actually and look for evidence. One of the things I'm encouraging people to do, and I'm really glad when they say we apply the potholer principle to this, which is not really my principle. This is something all journalists do, and that is to track down the source. So if someone gives you a piece of information, you say, okay, where did that come from? You then trace it back to that and then say, okay, where did that person get the information from? And then you check it back and you track back to where it originally came from. Yeah. And then see if it matches what the person claims it says.
I think one of the earliest videos of yours I watched was one of your first exchange with Tony Heller, I think. And it was either in that one or a related one where you forensically dismantled this famous graph that goes around that purports to show that carbon dioxide through the history of the world didn't have any relationship to the temperatures and so on.
Yeah.
And you couldn't, it was the last word really in dismantling that graph. You went back to the original sources, as you said, and you've identified what the missing third element was. And yet then I watch a video today and there it is again, and it still goes around and it goes around, and it almost seems impervious to the fact that that graph has been debunked, comprehensively debunked, that the sources have been shown that all the original sources were people who absolutely accepted that climate change was a thing. So these things refuse to die regardless. I mean, I'm sure it does chip away time, but it is slightly discouraging, I guess, when some of these things refuse to die.
Yes, on the other hand, I'm not too discouraged by that, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, when it comes to things like that, I mean, as you probably know, I spend months researching the videos that I do. People always say, oh, we wish you'd post more. Why don't you post more often? And yeah, I could, but then it wouldn't be the same depth of research. And that, to me, is absolutely crucial, because what I want to have is the definitive last word on this. There is no comeback. I mean, I do make corrections occasionally if there are little things like I get a name wrong or a pronunciation wrong, which is another thing. But as far as the facts go, you cannot fault this debunking of this graph. Now, the graph you're referring to was one by the carbon dioxide measurements, which were done by Berner, and the temperature measurements done by Scotties. And both of them, as you rightly say, accept in fact, they're big proponents of the link between carbon dioxide and global temperature. Now, but the reason I'm not discouraged is because once my video is out there, which is free for anybody to copy, to mirror, to send out, then every time that graph comes up, what I would like to see is that people then say, but here is the definitive debunking of that. And I think most people, when they look at that graph, even rational people, would say, wow, yeah, they've got a point. These conspiracy guys have got a point. There is absolutely no link between the two. Then someone says, well, go to this video and take a look. And then they'll go, I can't believe how easily taken in I was. And that's what I want people to get the hang of, is to say, I was taken in by this. I cannot believe that I fell for this. And that will make them a little bit more suspicious the next time it comes around.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Now, you and I have both spoken on our channels about the fact that the political right can be true to its traditions while taking climate change seriously. In the US, they seem as far away from that as ever. I mean, there are moderates in the Republicans, but they're not in the ascendancy for sure at the moment. Australia has its own excitements. Are you hopeful or are you pessimistic for outlook on progress on that? Because surely, ultimately, you can't have a position where one political party has one set of policies and the other is going to reverse it as soon as they switch over. You're going to have to build an agreement cross-party. How far away do you think we are from that?
I think we're getting there, and I think the really encouraging thing is now that renewable energy, the market is working on this, and I mean, I've done quite a few stories outside of YouTube. I mean, I do my normal work reporting on this, and it's interesting. I did a feature recently on hydrogen, and it's interesting that this is being Australia is way behind the curve in this, and then the government's really not very proactive in getting a hydrogen economy going. But the leadership is all happening in South Korea and Japan and China, where they are the ones demanding that Australia start, getting its act together and becoming a big producer of hydrogen, because they want our hydrogen here in Australia. So they're really the ones that are motivating Australia to make the move. And the reason they're doing it is because they know that there's a commercial future in it. Now, I've always maintained that the way this is going to happen is only if it's commercially viable, because you're not going to get half of the population on board with this if they think that the answer to climate change is that we have to go back to the Stone Age, which is what a lot of America's commentators are saying, and what about my rights? My taxes are going to go up and I won't be able to drive my car. Yes, you will. And this is what we have to explain to them. Going into a carbon neutral economy does not mean sacrificing modes of transport, and it doesn't mean they have to pay higher taxes. Because one of the encouraging things now, and this is why I say it is driven by market principles now, is that renewable energy is cheaper than coal-fired power stations. This is for new ones, not for existing ones, but for new ones. If you want to build a plant from scratch to produce power, it's much cheaper to build a renewable energy one than it is to build a coal-fired one. And so the market is going to drive this. It could, of course, be encouraged by the government. That would be great. But I think it needs to be explained to people who are in favor of free enterprise and perhaps on the right of politics. I'm by no means on the left, and I think it's a question of saying there is a solution to this that you can get behind. And a lot of people on the left have said to me, when I did a video about this, they said, well, look, I don't like the idea of capitalism running this show and capitalism being the motivating force, but if it's going to work, then let's do it. So I think everybody should be able to agree. And I'll just say one more thing, Mallen. I've always said it's not climate change that worries me, because I know that it's a problem that we could overcome fairly easily in the next 5 years by just switching to different sources of energy and different methods of using energy and still maintain standards of living. What worries me is the mentality and stupidity of people. And it was rather like a doctor the other day who said, we're having to fight two things here in the hospital. One is we're having to fight the coronavirus, and the other thing is we're having to fight stupidity. Now, you can fight the coronavirus, but it's very difficult to fight stupidity. So unless you can actually get people to understand what the physics is all about, what the problem is, and what the solutions are, unfortunately, that's the thing that worries me and is going to drag this whole thing down.
And we have a range of politicians who, because of COVID, it's been very high profile, will swear that they are following the science. And sometimes maybe they are, but equally you get the sense sometimes that there is capacity to be allegedly following the science while also being acting stupidly, as you put it. And what people think the science is. I mean, some of the environmental campaigners who exaggerate the science, for instance, and will call you a denier if you suggest that ideas that there are imminent tipping points, they're going to turn the planet into Venus overnight or Jupiter or whatever. It is equally stupid.
Yes, and in fact, that's why I always go after both camps, because as far as I'm concerned, extremists, whatever your political persuasion, if you're misrepresenting science and you're ignoring the science, you're equally guilty as far as I'm concerned. But sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
No, not at all. I guess because both of us deal with issues around the pandemic and around climate change, it's very much the area where science meets public policy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you think that science does have special responsibilities when it's feeding public policy decisions of significant scope. I mean, locking down a society is a big intervention, net zero carbon by 2050 or 2060 is a big, ambitious program. Do the skeptics have at least one point that is tremendously valid, which is that science that is feeding those sorts of decisions should be a platform for challenge?
Oh yeah, and in fact, you noticed in my videos, I don't take a policy position. I never do. I will correct the science if it's misrepresented. I'll explain what the science is. And people are always saying to me, "Oh, but do you think lockdowns are a good idea?" I say, I'm not going to comment on that. That's not for me to say. I can tell you, for example, from the scientific point of view, that lockdowns are effective in reducing the spread of infection. That's a scientific fact. Whether or not you should be locking down, that is a policy decision. That's a political decision. Because you might be of the view that, okay, well, we accept the science that this is going to spread infection and it's probably going to end up killing more people than it would otherwise. There are reasons for that, but which I won't go into. We accept that, but we're prepared to pay that price in order to keep things open. And I said, well, that's fine. If that's what your opinion, I'm quite happy with that. As long as you accept the science and base your policy on that with your eyes wide open, I don't want to get into whether, solutions, based on different policies are a good idea or a bad idea. I can only tell you what would work. So it's the same with climate change, for example. I offered in a couple of videos a conservative solution to climate change. I'm not saying that is the solution. I'm not saying it's a good solution or a bad solution. It's just a solution that conservatives can get on board with because it embodies conservative principles. On the other hand, there might be people who are misanthropes and want humanity to die out who say, well, actually, I'm not in favor of doing anything about climate change because I want the world to degrade into a very hot planet and we get civil unrest and the rising ocean levels. That's fine. As long as you accept that that's what the science is, you can have that opinion. So I'm very careful to tread that line and only look at the science and say, what decision you make is up to you. And I'm not going to try and persuade you. I don't want to be an influencer on that.
And your channel is obviously a highly effective riposte to some of those who misrepresent the science. Do you ever take on some of the debates that we now have about the platforms, YouTube itself and Twitter and so on, where with the pandemic particularly, but it's not only been the pandemic, to be fair, and there's also been some political elements, particularly around Trump in America, where the platforms have become more active censors of certain positions. So there's certainly been some people who have put relatively mild, inquiring videos related to the pandemic that have either been removed by YouTube because they said, well, it didn't fit with the World Health Organization definition or something, which strikes me as a slightly dodgy premise to be censoring content. You're both a YouTuber and a journalist. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I kind of run the similar thing on my forum because I take a very active part in the forums or the fora of my various videos. I'm always interested in seeing what people say. I'm always interested in getting feedback, and I'm especially interested when people point out mistakes. So I am a kind of censor on that because I've got certain rules about that. I've had to take certain very racist messages off because one of my rules is no racism, and some of them are just so bad that I've even had to ban people. And some of the others, for example, plagiarizing, they're not allowed to take whole chunks of what someone else has written and then pass it off as their own work. And there are kind of rules. So I guess I am, in a way, doing that myself. But on the whole, I would much prefer that people have a platform where they could say whatever they like. They can insult me as much as they like. They can put a whole load of crappy misinformation out there, as long as they explain what the misinformation is. They can't just put a link up and say, watch this video, which is probably some crap video saying that dinosaurs ruled the earth 50 years ago and Jesus rode on one. I don't know, whatever. But no, I draw the line there. I say, no, instead of just telling us to watch this video or watch this link, explain what it is, put your evidence forward, let's have a discussion about it. This is a platform. So I never censor the most outlandish ideas as long as people put them there. And I think, yeah, there is a dangerous slippery slope if these platforms, which are supposed to be nothing more than message boards, you're supposed to be just pinning up these messages on YouTube and Facebook and so on, where they start saying, no, we don't agree with that, so we're going to take it off. It's worrying. I think there's a very clear distinction you could say where if someone says we all ought to go out and kill Nancy Pelosi because she's clearly a traitor, yeah, I think I would take that off.
Yes.
Any kind of incitement, anything that is racist to the point that you're inciting people to harm others, I think that's a very clear line in the sand that I would.
Part of the challenge, though, isn't it, that we're now getting the language of harm that is becoming part of a natural political discourse. Whether it's if you say, I don't want to wear a mask, then someone can say, well, that's encouraging people to do something that might harm others. And in America now, with some of the identity politics stuff, a lot of the people will say, oh, well, you saying that now makes people like me feel unsafe. And so this language of harm now, the barriers of this are being stretched in a way that I think you and I would sit back and say incitement to actually do damage to someone through violence is incitement. But the line seems to be getting moved quite a lot now in the modern discourse.
And that's always the problem, isn't it? Because where do you draw a line in certain things like that? That's a really difficult thing. I mean, telling... saying we need to kill so-and-so because she's a traitor is, then you say, in theory, she ought to be killed. Or when I'm around her, I'm not going to wear a mask, even though I'm COVID positive. Okay, then you're beginning to sort of blur the lines a little. I don't wear a mask in the supermarket, and I would encourage others not to. That is tricky, isn't it? Because then you're then imposing your understanding of whether masks work or not on somebody else who might have a different view, because there are different views on masks. Yes. I mean, to a lot of people, the idea that wearing a mask is the be-all and end-all, for example, and might lead to bad behavior whereby you then don't socially distance and you don't wash your hands because you think, oh, I'm okay because I'm wearing a mask. So there are people who quite legitimately say mask wearing is probably not a good idea. And we don't want to silence those. I think the discussion is the thing that needs to be encouraged. But, I don't have a solution, Mallen. I wish I did, but I do agree with you that it's a difficult line to draw, and it's worrying that these social media platforms that are supposed to be platforms, they're not newspapers, printing articles and being editors, they are platforms for other people's opinions, and it's worrying that they're beginning to have the heavy hand of censorship.
On the science side, obviously one of your biggest areas of focus is to look at the peer-reviewed research and as the most reliable source. One of the talking points over the last few years, of course, has been the replicability crisis in certain branches of science, more perhaps than others, but certainly as a general question mark about some of the classic research, particularly in psychology and some of the other sciences, simply can't be replicated. And there are big suspicions that there is a significant body of what had been considered to be known that is now suddenly up for question. How undermining is this of faith in science at all? Faith is the wrong word, but trust in the solidity of the research that's been done to date. Because I get the sense that it's more robust in some areas than others, but nevertheless, of course, there's going to be those who will grab hold of it and just use it to dismiss any science for results of which they don't like. I mean, okay, put them to one side. But how big a challenge is this generally to the credibility of the scientific community at a time when we're leaning on science in a public policy sense and in a trust sense more heavily than we ever have?
Oh, it is a problem if it's misrepresented and misunderstood. You probably know there's a great hierarchy inside. I'm not sure of your background actually. You have a science background yourself?
I don't.
Oh, okay. I mean, mine was in geology, although I was only a geologist for 2 years, and I wasn't a very good geologist. But it's interesting that there is this hierarchy. So, I mean, I kind of look down my nose a little bit at psychology and sociology, and well, they're not really sciences; they're social sciences, and they're relegated in the journal's hierarchy to a completely different section. And I was at a dinner party not so long ago where there was a couple of physicists, and they said, well, geology, I mean, that's not real science, is it? Not like physics. Physics is real science. So there's the hard sciences, then there are the earth sciences, and then there are the social sciences. Now, the replicability problem, and here I'm showing my snobbishness again, is mainly in the medical field and the social sciences. There was this. I did a video on the can we trust peer-reviewed papers, and one of the reviews that I looked at was in Nature that had looked at a number of papers, and ones that had been redacted or had various problems, and they had the different subjects there and the number of papers that had had corrections made to them or been completely redacted. And physics was like this, geology was a bit more like that, and then you had chemistry and biology, and then medicine was right up there. And this is the problem. It's in certain fields, and every time someone wants to challenge science, they will always come onto my channel and say, yes, but peer-reviewed papers don't work. Look at this paper and then they had to change it because. And I said, you're going to quote me a medical paper, aren't you? Because medicine is an incredibly hard subject to make into a hard science, because you can't do experiments on people the same way that you can with lab rats.
Yes.
And certainly not the same way you can with a piece of metal or a chemical substance. If you're a chemist or an engineer or a physicist, you can put things through the mill and you can pressurize them and you can find them boiling points and melting points. You can't do that with human beings. So by its very nature, a lot of what medicine is about statistics. There are so many variables in medicine, and you can't experiment with people. So you have to just look at all the statistics and work out what might be doing this and what might be doing that. And this is why coffee's a carcinogen, and no, it's not, it's good for you. And hang on a minute, no, it might be a carcinogen after all, because there's no way they can actually trap people for 50 years in a prison cell, feed one lot with coffee and feed the other lot with something else and see what the difference is. And the other problem with replicability is that there are so many papers coming out now, because we've got so many of these new online journals, that there's a flood of stuff that isn't properly peer reviewed. And I think I saw a statistic that pre-internet that every paper gets read, I think, 1.5 times on average, or sorry, cited 1.5 times. So some of them might get cited like 5,000 times if they've been in Nature or Science, but some of them never get cited at all. Most of them never get cited. And so they, people do these things for their PhDs, hand them in, and then no one ever looks at them. No one ever tries to replicate them because they might not even be aware of them. So, yeah, it's becoming an increasing problem because of the volume of papers being printed. In my humble opinion, I have to say, I'm not a researcher. I've just been around researchers for the last 30 years and spent a lot of time reporting on them. And this is just what I found. It's that the problem of the flood, and also the problem that this is mainly relegated to one or two subjects: medicine, sociology, and psychology, and so on. I like to think that, I know for a fact from what Nature found when it was looking at these papers, that the hard sciences and the earth sciences are not quite so prone to this kind of thing.
Peter, I know that we're nearly out of time. It's a fascinating conversation. I could have gone on for a lot longer. You on your channel, you encourage people to support a charity, Health in Harmony. Why did you select that charity? Do you want to say something quickly about that?
Yeah. I mean, people were asking me, "Oh, we'd like to donate to a Patreon account. Do you have a Patreon account? And we'd like to give something for the channel." So I just said, "Oh, look, just give it to charity." And then I realized, well, hang on, there's a charity that I really, really like, and it was one that I covered. I was doing a story for the BBC out in Borneo. I had been to the Whitley Awards in London, which is an environmental awards, and the winner of not just one of the finalists, but the winner of the whole thing, who got the gold award, was an Indonesian dentist called Hotlin Umpusungu. And her project was absolutely fascinating. And so I spoke to a producer who worked on a program at the BBC called Costing the Earth. I said, look, we've got to do something on this woman. She's just amazing. And so they sent me out to Borneo, and I did a 30-minute program on it. And I was just blown away with how effective it was. And I discovered Hotlin wasn't the only one. There was also another doctor out there called Canary Webb, who had co-founded it and who basically came up with the idea. And I thought, well, if people really want to help the channel, instead of giving money to me, why don't they give money to this charity? So I was just blown away when the charity told me within the first few months how many donations they'd got. And I thought, wow, this is actually working. So they're now up to over $100,000 US dollars, which is really good going. And it's helped them expand into Madagascar and Brazil. So on the days when I feel, oh God, do I really want to get into doing some of this, work for my next video and so on, I think, well, yes, I need to get it out there because that's going to donate a few more $1,000s for them, and I can think of all the good work they're going to do. So I encourage people to watch the channel, and if they do watch it, why not throw $1 or $2 in the way of the charity for my pains?
Yeah. And there'll be a link to the charity in the video description if you want to act on that straight away. potholer54, thank you very much indeed for your time. My final question for you is there anything particular that makes you hopeful for the future?
Gosh. I don't have much of a future, so I've got to think of what my kids would want for their future. I'm hopeful that we are turning a corner in understanding the importance of science. I mean, I know that I've had this discussion about people going online. I'm always optimistic. I'm probably too optimistic, Mallen. I'm not the right person to be asking, because I'm going to say how I think really things will come together when they're probably not. But I'm always an optimist, because every stage of my life, whenever I've been down and out and sleeping in chicken sheds or on the ground and been out of work, something comes up, and it's a question of grabbing opportunities. So I've always got to be very optimistic. But I'm hoping two things will happen. One, I'm hoping that the problems that we've had when people look back on this COVID year that we've had and all the deaths that resulted as a result of the stupid misrepresentation of science, that people will say we need to start trusting the experts again, because they did have it right from the start, and the politicians and the people who denied that this was happening got it wrong. And the other thing I'm hopeful for is I'm reporting all the time on new technologies, and it's such a wonderful field to be in, because when you're visiting laboratories, you're seeing the technology of tomorrow, and you're learning for the first time what other people are going to discover in 5 years' time and are going to be using. And so I'm always hopeful for that. Having said that, when the internet first came out, I wrote a column saying, this has got no future. I'm ashamed to say, in those days we had CompuServe. Do you remember CompuServe? And the download speed on the first time I subscribed to CompuServe, the first time I got connected to the internet, the download speed was 2.4 kilobits per second.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to load up a page, you'd watch the page go down like this. You go off, make a cup of tea, come back again, it'd be halfway down. You'd start reading from the top, and then you'd have to read every line as it appeared, and then you'd realize this isn't the page I want, and you'd have to go and find another one. And they never had the right information. Companies never had phone numbers and contact details on there, and it was so frustrating. And I wrote a column out of frustration. I said, this is the most stupid thing I've ever seen. It takes so long to download, and the content is rubbish. It's not going to go anywhere. Now, what I forgot was technology always improves. And I think that's what we have to remember. However we look at the technology today, it's going to get better. And we're looking, as I say, I'm looking at things now that in 5 years' time are going to get better and better. And so from the technology point of view, I hope that's going to get us out of the hole that we're in.
Brilliant. potholer54, thank you so much for your time. And if anyone hasn't yet seen the channel, I highly recommend it. One of the best on YouTube by far. Thanks very much.
You're so kind. Thank you.